think about change, I think there are some factors to remember about organizational change. And we're all virtually nonprofit organizations here, so I'll speak to this from a nonprofit viewpoint. One point about change. There's really only one person that likes change, and that's a baby. So virtually everybody else in your organization is not going to necessarily be doing handsprings when you suggest we're going to do this really substantive change. You need data. You need a lot of data, a lot of supportive data to reinforce your decisions. And so this is stolen from Pat Bassett. In God we trust, everybody else bring data. So as you go about this, that's important. When you're thinking about change, you've got to look at these. If you're going to add X number, even one Chinese youngster, how does that fit those components of your organization? And I want to bring focus to the very bottom one, contribution margin. This is something we sometimes don't like to talk about as nonprofits, but I have to contend that I think probably the vast majority of us, as we think about expanding our student populations, contribution margin is a factor in it. And it may be the leading factor initially. It may become a secondary factor down the road. But what is the net income from those youngsters you can provide to operations that benefits everyone else is a key factor as you go about that. My belief is that in order to include everybody in those decision-making processes, it's important to take a team of people and let them see how others do this work. I think we get an awful lot when we simply sit with our professional peers and talk about serving Chinese kids or serving Asian kids or serving whatever child you want to serve. And I also think if you're trying to get buy-in within your total organization, take your history teacher with you. Let your history teacher talk with a history teacher at another school and say, how does this really impact your culture here? So I feel strongly about, as you think about change and you think about adding large numbers of youngsters potentially, visit other schools that do it. I would also suggest, and there are some very traditional boarding schools here, traditional boarding schools have been doing this for a long time. I would suggest if you're not a traditional boarding school and you're thinking about adding a significant number of boarding youngsters, go visit a boarding school. See how they do it. They've done it for centuries, and I think they do it pretty well. And so I think there's a lot you can really learn from those schools, but also go to schools like your own that have made these changes and see how they are doing it. I think you've got to involve key personnel in your school and from your board. Those people need to buy in. And obviously you need to put the data together from those visits. Some important questions to consider. What's this admissions thing going to cost you? What's it cost for staffing, salaries, publications, travel, finder's fees? All of those need to be taken into account as you think about adding a program. Facilities, what's that going to mean to you? How are you going to house them? You're going to do homestays, you're going to remodel existing buildings, you're going to build dormitories. You know, what are you going to do? Where are these kids going to play? How are you going to transport them? They all eat. You hope. All of that needs to be taken into account as you go about this work. Tom mentioned residential curriculum. When you go into the boarding business, there needs to be a curriculum for 3 in the afternoon until 8 the next morning. Just like there's an English curriculum and a history curriculum. And there need to be measurable outcomes for those kids in that curriculum. And there need to be measurable ways that you as an institution measure your success in your residential curriculum. Listed on the slide is a number of the things you just need to be thinking about, and many have been spoken to already. The academic piece. which we've heard from already, Karen and Maureen. How is that all going to fit together? How's that going to impact class size? How does that impact every component of that? Continue to gather that data as you make the decision. College counseling, as I think we've heard, is a far bigger factor than maybe we may have guessed initially. The staffing you may be required to employ to do the college counseling to the level that is expected is a different ball of wax. The impact on your administrative staff. You need to take a look at that and look at the schools that have such programs. And everywhere I go in my role as executive director, many people will say, gosh, we're too many administrators here. Way too many administrators, way top heavy. Here's the role of an administrator in a school from my opinion. The administrator's sole responsibility is to provide you, the teacher, what you need to do an extraordinary job. And that encompasses a tremendous amount of work. And so in order to make these kinds of things work, you've got to make sure you've got the infrastructure in place to accommodate all of those needs, both from teaching to leading and administering these programs. Cost, volume, profit analysis. I'm an old history teacher. I headed a school at one time. And without going into a long dissertation, we were having some difficulties. And a board member said to me, have you looked at your cost, volume, profit analysis? I said to my business manager, what's that? Okay? And I learned from this trustee, when you think about making these kinds of changes, you've got to really separate out your cost, what are fixed, what are variable, what are going to go away, what are going to stay, how is that all going to work, what are your direct costs for the program, what's your gross revenue, how much of that's going to get then applied to your operations. Are you willing to run a deficit in a program because they bring programmatic value to your school? I advocate to schools, if you want to enroll a lot of international youngsters who are all full freight, and you're having a hard time getting the kind of mix that you want, have you thought about providing some significant financial aid so that you can then create a more balanced residential student population? When you look at your cost, profit, volume analysis for those, so to speak, high aid kids, it may show less than a net zero, but if you recognize that the value they bring to you far exceeds the financial piece, I think those are good decisions to make. And so I encourage you, as you go about this kind of a process, to think about what you want the program to look like in total and know that every piece to it has its own cost, profit, volume analysis that you need to look at as you go about putting it in place. Contribution margin is I've spoken to it. Our real task here is how do we provide extraordinary programs to every youngster at our school? And across the board, almost all independent schools seem to spend more than they receive. That's why we have development programs, that annual funds, and how do we raise enough money to do what we want? So, that being said, when you enroll large numbers of international kids, how much are you rolling into the actual bottom line when it's all said and done? When you're talking with people at your school, building that team, how receptive are they to having residential students? How will it impact your culture? I bet teachers are worried about their workload. Of course they are. And what's their expectation going to be outside of the classroom now that you're adding this group of kids? What's their adjustments going to be? What are their housing options? All of these things are really big factors as you go about this kind of a process, and I encourage you to take a good block of time when you do it. All said and done, you've got all of your factual data, you've got good observations, even though many are subjective from various interviews you've done with places you've visited, you're able to make recommendations based on that. you should be able to really write down, this is the rationale that we have used to make this decision. And then you have a set of action items and timeframes to implement your program. It should be a very deliberate, well thought out, well orchestrated program. And I think when you do that, you actually end up then with sustainable change that results in a real growth of your school. Plan your work, work your plan. It's a pretty simple thing. Compile and synthesize the data. And again, my quote back to data. Make sure that you've got the data in place that supports what you want to see happen at your institution.
Okay, thank you very much.